is something rather new, even in our lifetime. 10 years ago it didn't exist. And 100 years ago it was probably seen as madness, which it is, if you think about it. You know, everything has its good sides, but you know, the youngsters now being on 24/7, having a little beep in the middle of the night so that they don't miss a single mail. It's nuts. Because in a certain way our body has rhythms and blues which go back a long time, and if we go too much contrary, despite the fact that obviously there's some plasticity, and we're not just conservative, and we can certainly grow and move on and so on, but the thing has its limitations. If you think about sleeping, for example, 100 years ago the average sleeping time was 10 hours. Meanwhile, even our social perception has changed. You know, someone comes to me and he or she says, you know, I'm sleeping 9 hours a day. And in my mind, somewhere it says, isn't that a little bit much? You know, critical German mind. So, but the average sleeping time, meanwhile, is 7. Okay, so take that to another 100 years. If you think about the acceleration of life, it's probably just going to be 25, the way it turns over. And we're going to be at an average sleeping time of 4. Now, at a certain point, you know, if you're sitting in a monastery and meditating all day long and night long, that's perfectly fine. You know, but in a normal life, you will come to certain limitations. Okay? And stress is basically happening when our own resources, what we can handle, get overwhelmed by the circumstances of life. Now, it was one of these Hungarians, Hans Selye, who came over to America in the 30s or so, ended up at McGill in Montreal, and framed the word stress. There was no stress until this Hungarian guy invented it, 1940. Okay, can you imagine life without stress until 1940? Well, he didn't quite invent it. He just researched on it. He was a prolific researcher. The guy published 1,700 scientific papers. Madness. Okay, huh? It was probably not. You can imagine. So, the 1,700 papers. And he came up with this whole thing. He called it adaptation response. That means how do we adapt to adverse circumstances in life.
What was his name again?
Hans Selye. S-E-L-Y-E. Selye. I'm not sure how you pronounce it in Hungarian, but he was one of these people, like Franz Liszt or who else? George Soros, you know, all these popular people here. So, adaptation. And he saw that there was he broke it down basically as an alarm phase. Acute stress, you're alarmed. If the stress persists, you adapt to it, the unbelievable ability of humans to adapt to stuff. Okay? You don't even know you're in stress anymore. That's basically our average state. And at a certain point, you burn out. Yeah? So it wears you down. And this is kind of the career, how he saw it, the stress career. And initially, stress was thought as this external thing that comes at you. Yeah? Which could be your boss, your wife, an accident, a trauma, a war, a famine in the old days, stuff like that. Yeah? Things that come at you. And the bigger the event, the bigger the stress. And then they took it over and said, well, it actually happens in our personal lives, and the bigger the event, the bigger the stress. So if you go to jail, has a certain stress scale, which is about as big as you getting married. Interesting, yeah? That's how they put that up. Because that's how they did. I'm not implying anything. So and it was basically change. Yeah? The theory that the bigger the change is, the more there's stress on us, and certainly marriage is a life-changing event. So high stress, going to jail, life, yeah? You get that. So then it turns out, after a while of more and more research, that it was actually not so much the outer event, otherwise we all would have the same amount of stress under the same circumstances, but we don't. Some people have this unbelievable ability to be resilient, stress hardy. Yeah, if you look at your lawyer or somebody's lawyer, normally these are stress hardy people. They train that in their system, however they do it. And on the other extreme, there are people who get stressed out by a fly flying by, yeah, and are very sensitive to stress and over-perceive stress and so on. And these are the two extremes. So it's in a way our own reaction, and in turn something we do inside that determines how much we're stressed out. I mean, obviously, if you're under extreme conditions, you know, everybody gets stressed out. If you have no food for some days and it's icy cold and you have no clothes, well, there's hardly anybody who doesn't get stressed out, yeah, unless you're one of these Tibetan monks who know how to burn their brown fat and somewhat survive these things, you know, but you're not, and then you don't have this ability. But under normal circumstances is how you perceive the world, what you perceive as your resources, so that you can meet that what's outside, which obviously has something to do with the expectations. If you have an expectation that something harmless will happen and something terrible will happen, you're going to be stressed out. Okay? So if you're going to have the expectation that always something terrible will happen, you're always going to be stressed out. So it's our expectation, what we do in our mind, how we evaluate a situation, that determines how stressed we are. And somewhat having that sense of being in control, the sense of being in control makes all the difference. So it's not being in control. That's the issue. The sense of being in control, which can be illusionary but healthy. Yeah, someone called that healthy illusions. Sometimes, you know, we have a positive mindset, that mindset medically, in terms of disease susceptibility, in terms of longevity, is beneficial to someone who has a pessimistic, glass is half empty mindset. Okay? So it's a little bit how we perceive the perception, which is in a way unbelievable if you think about it, this power we have to perceive the world as stressful or not stressful. So now stress is a very, very basic function, yeah, despite the fact that we only have a word for it since 70 years. And if you look at a unicellular organism, an amoeba, one cell only, which is around since a few years, probably people guesstimate 2 to 3 billion years. Yeah, the Earth is about 4 or 4.5 billion years old. So these fellows, our ancestors, are around since so long time. And their basic function was eating, reproducing, which at that time was basically just being separated in the middle, splitting into two, kind of a form of whole body sex, and defense or aggression, yeah, and stress. So very basic functions. If you see under the microscope a unicellular organism and you come in with a tiny little needle, you know, and this fellow is cool and groovy and goes along, whatever it does, the needle comes along, within a split second the whole situation, the whole one membrane, the whole one cell membrane changes, the state changes, it gets more dense, and so on, it contracts and what have you. Unicellular beginning of life, yeah? Billions of years ago. So we have the same thing, just a little bit more sophisticated, because we're a few trillion cells meanwhile, and not just one. So what happens when we're stressed out? Our brain perceives a situation as stressful, and then it switches on a program within split seconds, which basically activates a whole part of the autonomic nervous system, your so-called sympathetic nervous system, which turns things on. And at the same time, it sends nerve signals to the adrenals, and the adrenals then pour out adrenaline and cortisol and epinephrine and norepinephrine and all these wonderful stress hormones. And between the nerve signals of the of the sympathetic nervous system and the adrenal hormones, then you have the whole range of stress responses, which on a physical level is some of the things you talked about. It turns on the heart to beat faster. Now you always have to think fight or flight, defense. That's a situation where suddenly you're confronted with in the old scenario, with a dangerous scenario. Yeah? An enemy, an animal suddenly comes your way, and between just digesting your last food and thinking about what you're going to do tonight, you suddenly, within a split second, have to be ready to save your behind. Yeah? And this whole apparatus, the stress system, provides that. So fast heartbeat, fast pulse so that they can run away. The heart pumps faster, more intensely, produces more blood. Your vessels constrict to put your blood pressure shoots up. Vessels constrict partially because in the old scenario you could get hurt and vulnerable and you don't want to bleed to death. At the same time, you start sweating, okay? The car needs some cooling, fight or flight, sweating. Your breathing gets more shallow and fast. Your pupils change, get wide. Your digestion is switched off because you don't need to digest right now. You need to fight. So everything goes to the muscles.